The first thing that failed was the clock. Not the engine instruments, not the compass, not the radio. Just the small, luminous hands mounted above the navigator's table, their steady crawl slowing until they stuttered and froze, suspended between minutes as if time itself had decided to wait. The navigator noticed it without urgency. He had been watching those hands for hours already, measuring the mission in tiny, silent increments. He reached up, tapped the glass once with a knuckle. Nothing moved. He made a note in the margin of his chart anyway, out of habit. Ink on paper was comforting. It meant order still existed somewhere. The bomber droned forward through layered darkness, its engines holding a constant pitch that vibrated to the navigator's bones. The aircraft smelled of warm oil, canvas, and the faint metallic tang of oxygen. The crew barely spoke now. They had passed the target long ago, crossed back over the coast, and settled into that long, deceptive stretch where the danger was supposed to thin out. Home lay somewhere behind them, unseen, waiting. The navigator leaned closer to his table, his shoulders brushing the cold aluminum ribs of the fuselage. He checked the compass again. The needle trembled. It did not spin. It did not settle. It quivered, as if uncertain which direction deserved its loyalty. He frowned and adjusted the small correction knob. Careful, precise. The needle shivered harder, then sagged to one side and stayed there. He waited. He had learned early not to rush instruments. They were like frightened animals. Push them too fast, and they lied. Still nothing. A faint pressure gathered behind his eyes. Not panic, not yet, just the awareness that something small had gone wrong in a place where small errors grew teeth. He slid his fingers along the chart, tracing the thin pencil line that marked their intended course. It looked clean and confident on paper. Reality rarely did. Compass acting up, he called forward, keeping his voice level. The pilot did not answer right away. The engines filled the gap. Then, over the intercom, a calm reply, "Keep an eye on it." The navigator nodded to himself, though no one could see it. He always nodded when things started to slip. A private ritual, a way of saying, "I see you." The air outside was clear but moonless, the stars sharp and distant, pinned against the black like cold witnesses. He could see them through the astrodome above his station. Normally, he used them with instruments, with calculations, with confirmations. Tonight, he found himself looking at them longer than usual, letting their positions settle into memory. The bomber shuddered once, a small cough of turbulence, then steadied. Somewhere aft, a crewman shifted, boots scraping softly. The intercom crackle was static, then went silent again. The navigator checked the radio repeater. Dead. He pressed the transmit switch anyway, listening to the hollow click echo uselessly in his headset. No hum, no response, just the steady breathing of the aircraft itself. That was when the pressure behind his eyes sharpened. He ran his checklist in silence. Compass unreliable, clock frozen, radio out. The altimeter still read steady, but he no longer trusted it. Instruments failed rarely one at a time. They failed in clusters, like men under fire. He wiped his hands on his trousers, surprised to find them damp. The cold seeped through his gloves, through the metal floor, into his legs. He adjusted the small lamp over his table, but the light flickered weakly, then dimmed. He left it as it was. Darkness sharpened attention. "Navigator," the pilot's voice again, quieter now. "Still checking," he replied. He did not add anything else. There was no language yet for what he was feeling. He tilted his head back and studied the stars properly now, aligning familiar patterns against a faint memory of training nights and chalkboards and instructors who had spoken of dead reckoning as a last resort, a thing of theory more than practice. He named the constellations silently, anchoring himself to them. They were where they should be. That meant something, at least. But stars did not account for wind. He pulled out his drift meter, peered through it, and saw nothing but darkness rushing past. No ground lights, no coastline, just a suggestion of motion, guessed rather than seen. He calculated anyway, writing numbers that felt suddenly fragile, as if they might dissolve under scrutiny. The bomber pressed on, unaware of its growing isolation. Without radio, without instruments, it might as well have been the only machine left in the sky. The navigator felt that isolation settle around him, heavy and quiet. He thought of the map room they had left hours earlier, bright with lamps and cigarette smoke and voices calling out headings. That place felt impossibly far away now, like something remembered from another life. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead briefly against the cool surface of the table, not in despair, in focus. When he lifted his head, the compass needle had finally stopped moving. It pointed nowhere he recognized. He took a breath, slow and measured, and reached for his pencil again. Whatever was happening, it was happening now. The mission was no longer a line on paper. It was a decision unfolding minute by minute, guided by memory, stars, and the fragile belief that it could still lead them home. The navigator recalculated in silence, again and again, as if repetition might force the numbers to confess the truth. His pencil scratched softly against the chart, the sound almost swallowed by the engines. Each new line he drew felt less like guidance and more like an act of faith. He wiped the eraser crumbs away with the side of his hand and stared at the result. If his estimates were right, they should already be seeing something. Coastline lights, the faint suggestion of land interrupting the dark. There was nothing, just the same endless black, smooth and unbroken. Wind, he thought, stronger than forecast. But how much stronger? He glanced again at the stars. They had shifted, subtly but undeniably. Time had moved on without his clock's permission. He estimated the passage by the ache in his neck, by the dull fatigue pressing behind his eyes. He adjusted his mental model of their position, sliding the aircraft's invisible track across the chart in his mind. Memory replaced machinery. Course correction, he said into the intercom, keeping his tone neutral. He gave a new heading, careful not to sound unsure. The pilot acknowledged without comment, banking the bomber slightly. The aircraft responded with a low groan, like an old structure adjusting to weight. Somewhere, metal contracted in the cold. The sound felt louder now that conversation had thinned. Minutes passed, or longer. Time had become a texture rather than a measure, stretching, thinning, pulling tight. The navigator's thoughts began to wander despite his effort to pin them down. He remembered training flights over familiar countryside, instructors standing close, correcting mistakes before they mattered. He remembered the comfort of redundancy, one instrument failing, another confirming. That comfort was gone. There was only him, a table, and the sky. The intercom crackled briefly, with a burst of static that made his heart jump. He leaned toward, hopeful. Nothing followed. He exhaled slowly through his nose and forced his attention back to the present. Doubt, he knew, was contagious. If it reached his voice, it would spread forward, infecting hands on the controls, eyes scanning the dark. He could not afford that. Still, the isolation was undeniable now. They were cut off from the world below and the world behind. No friendly voices. No updates. No corrections drifting in from command. The bomber flew on, alone with its own momentum. He recalculated drift again, this time exaggerating the wind factor, pushing the estimate farther west. He hesitated, then committed. Better to overcorrect than miss entirely. He announced a new heading. This time, there was a pause before the pilot replied. Confirmed that, came the answer, measured but edged with something new. The navigator swallowed. Confirmed. It was a lie in the smallest, most necessary sense. He believed it as much as he needed to. The aircraft turned. The stars slid across the Astrodome in a slow arc. He tracked them carefully, aligning memory with movement, counting heartbeats in place of seconds. Each beat was a marker, each breath a calculation. The cold deepened. It crept into his gloves, his sleeves, his bones. His fingers stiffened around the pencil. He flexed them one at a time, refusing to let discomfort distract him. Discomfort was easy. Uncertainty was not. Another half hour, he guessed, passed without change. No land. No lights. The navigator felt the first real weight of doubt settle in his chest. Heavy and unwelcome. Not panic. Panic was loud. This was quieter. More dangerous. He imagined the bomber's path from above, a solitary line wandering across an invisible map, each correction bending it farther from certainty. He imagined fuel ticking down, not as a gauge reading but as a slow draining of possibility. Fuel check, someone said over the intercom, casual but pointed. The pilot answered. The numbers were not alarming. Not yet. The navigator pressed his lips together. Time was still on their side, but time without direction was just distance traveled in the wrong place. He stood carefully, bracing himself against the fuselage, and climbed slightly to peer through another window. The view did not change. Darkness pressed back from every angle, indifferent to his scrutiny. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the unspoken alternative, that he was wrong, that his memory, his stars, his dead reckoning were leading them not home, but deeper into nowhere. The thought did not paralyze him. It sharpened him. He returned to his seat and began again from the last point he trusted. He stripped away assumptions, rebuilt the path piece by piece. He listened to the engines, to the way the aircraft rode the air, searching for subtle cues. The bomber felt heavy, steady, no sign of imminent failure. That at least was honest. He announced another correction, smaller this time, incremental, cautious. The pilot responded immediately. The tone had changed, less questioning now, more reliance. The navigator felt that reliance like a hand placed firmly between his shoulders. With it came pressure. Every decision now carried the weight of 6 lives, of a machine burning fuel with every mile. There would be no external rescue for a wrong turn, no gentle correction drifting in from a tower. Only consequences, arriving later and without warning. The stars began to fade slightly as thin cloud crept in from the west, veiling their sharp edges. The navigator felt a flare of urgency. He memorized their positions quickly, committing angles and distances to heart before they blurred completely. "Clouds ahead," someone muttered. "I know," he said, though no one had asked him. The bomber flew on, wrapped in its cocoon of noise and cold. The world reduced to what could be seen, remembered, or guessed. The navigator sat hunched over his table, pencil poised, eyes flicking between chart and sky, holding doubt at bay through sheer tension. He did not know yet whether his course would save them. He only knew that turning back now, admitting uncertainty aloud, would fracture something essential. So he kept his voice steady, his hands moving, and guided the aircraft forward into the dark, hoping that somewhere ahead, unseen but real, home was still waiting. The clouds swallowed the stars without ceremony. One moment they were there, familiar, distant, reliable, and the next they were gone, erased by a thin, pale veil that thickened by degrees. The Astrodome turned from a window into universe, into a dull mirror, reflecting the navigator's own face back at him, pale and tight around the eyes. He stared upward longer than necessary, as if the stars might reconsider and return. They did not. The bomber entered the cloud layer gently, but the change was immediate. The air grew heavier, the engine sounding slightly muted, as though wrapped in cloth. Moisture crept along the metal skin of the aircraft, collecting in cold beads that glimmered faintly in the low light. Somewhere outside, ice began to form. The navigator felt time stretch again, thinning to a fragile thread. Without stars, without clock, without compass he trusted, he was navigating now almost entirely in his head. Every estimate relied on the last, each one stacked atop uncertainty, like stones balanced by instinct alone. He adjusted his chart once more, but the paper felt suddenly inadequate, flat, lifeless, unable to contain the complexity of what they were doing. The pencil hovered, then moved. It always moved. Stopping was worse than being wrong. "Maintain heading," he said into the intercom, his voice low, controlled. The pilot acknowledged. No questions this time. That silence carried weight. Trust had solidified into dependence, and dependence into something sharper. The navigator felt it settle across his shoulders like an extra layer of gear he had not trained for. The cloud thickened. Visibility dropped to nothing beyond the bomber's nose. The world shrank to the interior of the aircraft. The vibration of the engines, the faint rattle of loose fittings, the hiss of oxygen. Even sound seemed closer now, contained. He closed his eyes briefly, not to rest, but to picture the sky as it had been minutes ago. He replayed the star field in memory, aligning it with imagined movement, counting silently. One count for each imagined mile. It was imperfect, but it was all he had left. A sudden jolt ran through the aircraft, sharper than before. The bomber lurched, then steadied, but the navigator's pencil snapped against the edge of the table, the lead breaking cleanly. His breath caught. "Light turbulence," the pilot said, as if to reassure himself as much as anyone else. The Navigator replaced the pencil with another, slower now, more deliberate. Turbulence meant unpredictable drift. Drift meant compounded error. The invisible path they were carving through the sky bent and twisted, without his consent. He recalculated again, this time with margins, so why they bordered on guesswork. He felt the thin line between confidence and stubbornness blur. Was he guiding them, or merely refusing to admit he no longer could? Minutes passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Then a voice from the rear. Ice build up. The Navigator closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Ice meant weight. Weight meant fuel burn. Fuel burn meant a narrowing window, one that did not care about courage or calculation. How bad? The pilot asked. Managing, came the reply, but the word carried strain. The Navigator forced himself to breathe slowly. Panic would speed his thoughts, make them sloppy. He needed slowness now, precision born of restraint. He leaned forward, pressing his palm flat against a chart as if to steady it. He chose a new heading, barely altered, almost symbolic, and passed it forward. It felt like placing a bet with nothing left to wager but belief. The bomber turned slightly. The movement was subtle, but he felt it immediately, his body tuned to changes in balance. He imagined the aircraft sliding through unseen currents, ice feathering its wings, fuel ticking away in silence. Time slowed further, each moment stretching until it felt examined, scrutinized. The Navigator became acutely aware of his own body. The ache in his lower back, the stiffness in his neck, the dryness of his mouth. These sensations anchored him. As long as he could feel them, he was still present. The cloud showed no sign of thinning. Without warning, a break appeared, a brief thinning in the gray, and through it, far below, a faint smudge of darkness against darkness. Land, or sea shadow, or nothing at all. The Navigator lunged toward the window, heart pounding, straining to see more. The gap closed almost immediately, the cloud sealing itself again, leaving only doubt behind. He sat back slowly, pulse loud in his ears. Had that been coastline? Had he just missed confirmation by seconds? He replayed the image again and again, but memory was already blurring it, reshaping it to fit hope or fear. Did you see that? Someone asked over the intercom. Yes, he said after a beat. I saw it. That admission tightened the space around him. Others had seen it too. Now they would wait for meaning. He recalculated yet again, adjusting the course to chase the possibility of land. It was a dangerous thing, to follow a glimpse, but ignoring it felt worse. He announced the heading, feeling the room hold its breath. The pilot complied. The bomber angled slightly downward, engines adjusting with a low, steady roar. The cloud began to thin in patches now, uneven, teasing. The Navigator kept his eyes fixed forward, scanning for any sign, light, shape, interruption. His calculations narrowed, sharpened. This was no longer abstract navigation. This was pursuit. Fuel came up again. Still acceptable. Still slipping. The cloud finally broke in earnest, peeling away to reveal darkness below that was not uniform. Shapes emerged, subtle, uncertain, but different enough to matter. The Navigator felt a surge of something dangerously close to relief, but he held it back. Premature relief killed discipline. Possible landmass, he reported, choosing his words carefully. The pilot leaned forward, straining to see. The bomber descended slightly, cautiously. The Navigator gripped the edge of his table, knuckles pale. If he was wrong now, the consequences would arrive quickly. There would be no time to correct, no space to pretend. The aircraft pressed on, nose pointed toward the dark shapes below. Time resumed its flow, suddenly urgent again, rushing to meet whatever waited beneath the cloud. The Navigator did not look away. The darkness below resolved itself slowly, reluctantly, as if the world were deciding whether to reveal the truth or keep it hidden a little longer. What had first appeared as vague texture now hinted at structure, uneven edges, subtle gradients, shapes that suggested elevation rather than empty water. The Navigator leaned forward, muscles tight, afraid that blinking might undo it. Land. Almost certainly land. But land could be enemy land just as easily as home. He forced himself to breathe evenly, counting each inhale, each exhale. Excitement was as dangerous now as fear. Either could tip his judgment past the narrow margin he was walking. "Hold altitude," he said quietly. The pilot complied, though the bomber's engines labored slightly, ice still clinging stubbornly to the wings. The navigator felt the vibration change, just enough to notice. He imagined fuel gauges sinking toward lines that meant decisions no one wanted to make. The shapes below grew clearer as thin cloud fragments slid past. He searched for signs, roads, rivers, lights, but the ground remained stubbornly mute, blacked out, concealed where had taught the land to hide as well as the sky. His mind raced through possibilities. If this was coastline, it should curve. If it was inland, there should be variation. He compared memory to sight, training to instinct. None of it aligned cleanly. Nothing ever did at this point. Another voice over the intercom. "Tense now. Fuel's not going to forgive much longer." The navigator nodded to himself, though again, no one could see it. This was the moment he had been circling without naming, the place where caution and indecision merged into the same failure. He closed his eyes briefly, assembling the last hours into a single fragile chain. The frozen clock, the dead radio, the trembling compass. The stars lost a cloud, each link imperfect. Together, they formed the only path he had. He opened his eyes and made the choice. "New heading," he said, voice firm despite the weight behind it. He gave the number slowly, deliberately. There was no hedging in it, no room for doubt to slip through. This was not an estimate now. It was a commitment. There was a pause on the intercom, longer than before. Then, turning, the bomber banked, heavier now, less willing. The navigator felt the shift deep in his stomach. If he was wrong, they would know soon. Too soon to undo it. They flew on, the ground sliding beneath them in slow, ominous motion. Still no lights. Still no confirmation. The navigator's thoughts narrowed to a tight focus, excluding everything that did not serve the moment. He watched for any change, any sign that would validate or condemn his decision. Minutes passed. Each one scraped raw. Then, faintly, impossibly, a point of light flickered below. The navigator's breath caught. Another appeared. Then another. Dim. Spaced far apart, barely daring to exist. Not flak. Not fires. Something steadier. Deliberate. "Lights," someone whispered. The navigator leaned closer to the window, heart pounding hard enough to feel in his throat. The pattern was wrong for enemy installations. Too sparse. Too cautious. This looked like a place trying not to be seen. A blackout village. Friendly territory, hiding from the same war that had nearly swallowed them whole. "Confirm heading," the pilot said. "Urgency sharp now." "Hold it," the navigator replied. His voice trembled despite him. He steadied it. Descend slowly. The bomber dipped, engines adjusting, ice cracking loose in small, metallic pops. The lights below grew clearer, more numerous, resolving into a fragile network that felt almost intimate after so much emptiness. A collective exhale moved through the crew, unspoken but unmistakable. The navigator slumped back against his table for just a moment, strength draining from him in a sudden rush. His hands shook now that the crisis had shape, now that survival seemed possible rather than theoretical. But he did not allow himself to rest. Not yet. There were still miles to go, still fuel to manage, still the delicate task of aligning themselves fully with safety. He made minor corrections now, cautious, incremental, guided by sight at last rather than memory alone. The bomber followed obediently, its earlier reluctance giving way to a steadier rhythm. Below, the light stretched into a thin line, a road, perhaps, or a river marking a familiar boundary. "Home side," someone said, barely louder than a breath. The navigator closed his eyes again, longer this time. The tension did not vanish, but it loosened its grip, retreating enough to let exhaustion seep in around the edges. He felt suddenly, acutely tired, more tired than he could remember ever being. He opened his eyes and kept working. Survival, he knew, was rarely a single moment. It was a sequence of choices made correctly just long enough to matter. The relief did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, uneven and delayed, like warmth returning to numb fingers. Painful at first, almost unwelcome. The navigator felt it in the slight, softening of shoulders across the crew, in the way voices over the intercom began to sound human again rather than carefully controlled. Below them, the dark land stretched out in muted certainty. Fields, hedgerows, the faint geometry of roads revealed only where the blackout lights dared to exist. The bomber was no longer alone in nothingness. It had context again, meaning, but relief did not erase consequence. The navigator looked down at his chart, now scarred with erasures, overwritten lines, corrections piled atop corrections. It was no longer record. It was evidence. He traced the final path with his finger, seeing how close it had come, how a slightly different assumption, a slightly different choice, would have bent that line into loss. His hands trembled again, this time without resistance. He let them, fuel critical. Came the report, quieter now, stripped of urgency and left with fact alone. "I know," the navigator replied. He did not add reassurance. None was needed. They could all feel it. The narrowing margin, the ticking presence of what had been spent and could not be reclaimed. He guided them the rest of the way with almost obsessive care. Every correction was small now, conservative, shaped by visible landmarks and remembered geography. The bomber descended in slow stages, engines easing back, as if the aircraft itself understood the need for gentleness after so much strain. As the airfield finally revealed itself, a darker void within darkness, edges defined by the absence of stars, the navigator felt surprising ache behind his eyes. Not tears, something deeper, a release of pressure he had been holding, without realizing how tightly. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, steady but changed. "We see it." The navigator nodded, throat tight. He had nothing to add. His work was done, and the knowledge felt strangely hollow. The bomber lined up heavy and scarred, ice long since shed but memory clinging stubbornly. The landing was rougher than usual, the wheels striking the runway with a jolt that ran through the navigator's spine. Metal protested, then steadied, then slowed. When the engines finally wound down, the silence was startling. It pressed in on them, thick and unfamiliar, broken only by cooling metal ticking softly, like an afterthought. No one spoke right away. There was no rush to move, to celebrate. Survival had not arrived with triumph. It had arrived with exhaustion. The navigator sat still at his table, staring at nothing. His chart lay abandoned beneath his hands. He did not feel victorious. He felt emptied. Eventually, someone laughed, short, brittle, almost surprised by the sound of it. Another voice followed, then another. The tension dissolved unevenly, releasing itself in small, human noises. The navigator finally stood, legs unsteady. He took one last look upward through the Astrodome. The sky above the field was clearing now, stars reappearing as if nothing had happened, as if they had never left. He felt a brief, irrational resentment toward them. As he moved toward the hatch, he realized something else had been left behind up there with the cloud and the darkness, a part of his certainty, a belief that preparation alone could shield you from chaos. He had brought them home, but it had cost him something quiet, invisible, and permanent. Morning did not arrive with ceremony. It crept in slowly, pale light seeping across the airfield, softening the hard edges of night. The bomber sat where it had been left, dark against the frost-dull ground, looking less like a weapon now and more like a tired animal that had finally stopped moving. The navigator stood a short distance away, hands in his pockets, watching breath fog in front of his face. The cold felt different in daylight, less threatening, more honest. He welcomed it. It kept him anchored. Around him, ground crews moved with quiet efficiency. No one hurried. No one asked questions yet. The aircraft was inspected, touched, acknowledged. Survival had become routine again, and that normalcy felt almost disorienting. He replayed the night without meaning to, not as a sequence of events, but as sensations, the way the engines had sounded when the compass failed, the texture of silence after the radio died, the moment the stars vanished. These impressions lingered more vividly than any calculation or decision. He realized, with a distant curiosity, that he could not remember the exact numbers he had used for the final heading, only the feeling of choosing it. Someone approached, an officer, clipboard in hand, but stopped a few paces away, as if sensing the space the navigator needed. They exchanged a brief nod. Words felt unnecessary, inadequate.